Thank you. Well, good morning. Good to see everybody. How are you liking this weather? That's what I'm talking about. It's nice to get outside again. All right, so we'll be in Luke 24 this morning, and I'm just going to cover a short part of this passage because it's a big story and it's got a lot in it. So we're looking on the section where Dennis read already. I want to look at, starting at verse 28. It says, "As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, 'Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over.' So he went in to stay with them." As I was looking at this passage, there's this one line that stuck out. Last week we explored how we might miss Jesus among us if we cling to things that we need to let go of, and the challenge of recognizing the risen, ascended Christ in our midst. And in this passage in Luke 24, Jesus is recognized after he's invited by the disciples, "Stay with us." And that's the part that stuck out to me. I kept reading that, and that had a, you know, when you're reading and the scriptures, and there's this thing that just keeps jumping out, has this thing behind it. And very often I believe that's how the Lord speaks to us through scripture, and if there's something he wants us to see, he'll very often emphasize a scripture. So anyway, I was doing some thinking on this week, and I have a few thoughts on this. This is going to be a little bit, there's going to be some academic stuff in here. I'm going to try to not get too heady on this, but I think there's some important stuff that I want to point out around this issue. And so we're going to look a little bit at ancient hospitality, because this is kind of what's going on here. Jesus is on the road. He's ascended, he's resurrected, he's resurrected, he's about to ascend, and these disciples, they just come alongside him, and he appears beside them, rather, and they begin talking and explaining, "Are you the only person who has no idea what's happened here?" And Jesus, just kind of patiently listens to them as they explain what's happened and how Jesus has been crucified and how they thought he was the one. And then, he's just kind of listening, and then he kind of rebukes them about being slow of heart to receive and understand and believe everything that the scripture has taught. And they're still kind of in the dark. They still don't know who he is, but they're listening to him. And then we get to this place where it's getting late, and they've reached their destination. And Jesus, I just love this. He acts as if he's going to go on. This is the Lord. This is the resurrected Lord, and he just, humbly kind of, waits for them to invite him. I just love that. So they it's getting dark. Come stay with us. He says, "Oh, okay." So Jesus stays with them, and he waited for their invitation. Stay with us. Stay with us. So in the ancient world, hospitality is a really, really big deal. Huge deal. And I want to just give a little bit of a snapshot of some things about the ancient world of hospitality. So there's 5 basic ways, and this is attested through Greek, Roman, Jewish sources, extra biblical. This is this is an ancient world thing. Hospitality is a very big deal. So there's 5 basic ways that hospitality was practiced. There's public hospitality. It's practiced by the state as part of the foreign policy. It's pretty good foreign policy, really. Your default is to show hospitality to foreigners. There's temple hospitality, which is designed to facilitate pilgrimages to holy places. So there was just an expectation that temples would be a place where people could come and stay and visit, and they would have hospitality around that. There's commercial hospitality, which enabled travelers to obtain food and lodging for a fee. By the time you get to the world of Jesus, the Romans have constructed an elaborate road system. If you know your history about Rome, they were innovators in this. They built roads in a way that nobody had ever done before, and so travel became much, much more possible than it had been previously. And because of that, commercial hospitality, such as inns and what we think of as hotels, Mary and Joseph stayed at, or wanted to stay at, an inn, so they had those available, but it was very early in the development of these things, and so commercial hospitality was sometimes okay and sometimes not so good. We kind of have hotels, let's just say it wasn't the Marriott or whatever. So sometimes it was all right, but sometimes a commercial hospitality or a place, an inn, so to speak, was nothing more than really a brothel. So that gives you an idea of kind of the range of things available for that. But they did exist. You also had private hospitality, and this is the kind of the big push of the New Testament when it's speaking of hospitality. Even though there was commercial hospitality, private hospitality was really emphasized to be something you kept practicing. You didn't just didn't just say, "Hey, go stay at the hotel, go stay at the inn." It was really encouraged that you would continue to practice private hospitality. Very esteemed, very encouraged, and seen as a moral virtue. Okay, so this is something where if you're a decent person, you invited people to stay at your place if they needed a place to stay. It was just a common decency. If you didn't do that, you're kind of a jerk. And so in our world, of course, we're like, yeah, I'd go stay at the hotel, right? We just don't have that cultural value because it's a different world and there's different things available now. But in the ancient world, that's how it was. The last one is theoxenic hospitality, which, this is funny, this is not even a word, except for in the world of scholarship. So I've joked with some people before about how when I was in seminary, we ran into this all the time, where scholars just make up words. They don't care. They just put two Greek words together or whatever, and they make a new English word. And it's not in the dictionary, and Microsoft Word doesn't recognize it. So you're writing a paper, and it keeps auto-correcting. It's really annoying, but I got through it. But this kind of hospitality is where humans provide hospitality to gods, or heroes, or various semi-divine guests. And so in the ancient literature and the ancient fables and myths and stories, you can read about this sort of thing all the time. Where the humans would provide hospitality to a god in disguise of some kind. And so they wouldn't necessarily know that that's who they were being hospitable to. And it was sort of a test. So, theoxenic, if you can see that word up there, it's two Greek words, theos, which means God, and xenia, which is the word for hospitality. A cognate of that word is xenos, which is where we get our word xenophobia, which is a fear of strangers, right? Phobia. Xenos means stranger or foreigner. And so xenophobia is a fear of strangers or foreigners, and this would result in, of course, them being neglected or abused or something like that. And a person who's a traveler, a foreigner in the ancient world is very vulnerable. Traveling to a different place where people don't know you. And this is why hospitality was such a big deal, because there's robbers, there's wild animals, there's all kinds of dangers that a foreigner or a traveler could encounter. And so if you didn't show hospitality to someone, you were basically sort of responsible for their welfare. So to extend hospitality to a stranger is very generous, very noble. And for a stranger to then take that hospitality and abuse or rob the person or do something like that, that was a great, great crime. That was just horrendous that somebody would do that. And of course, it probably happened. But there was this cultural kind of expectation that that's just something you don't do unless you are the scum of the earth. You don't do that sort of thing. Okay, so hospitality, big deal. In the Greeks, the Romans, this whole story of Helen of Troy, you guys all know the story of Helen of Troy, that starts with a hospitality breach. When Helen is seduced and taken away, that's a breach of hospitality, and they go to war over it. So that gives you another idea of kind of how serious of a thing that this was understood to be. Okay, so one more Greek word, and I'll stop with that. But philoxenia. So this is two words, friend and hospitality. And it means to host, a host's friendly treatment of a stranger as though he were a friend. So this is one of the things that is kind of an expectation where if you are hospitable to a stranger and you invite them in as a friend, you would create a formal bond with this person. You would make this official by when you send the stranger on in the next morning or however many, couple days if they stay that long. When you send them off, you would give them a gift. And this was understood as a formal connection that you've now introduced. If they accept the gift, then they accept the formal connection, the formal tie. And so this now becomes a, not legal, but a formal bond formed between these two families. And it goes beyond the two people who did the hospitality gift. It becomes a family ancestor thing. And so descendants later down the road of generations, they would often carry these things that they were called a token. I'm trying to find the token of hospitality. There's a word for it I'm not going to try to pronounce. But they would carry this token, and so the son of one of these bonds that might have been created a couple generations later, they could show up to the relatives of these two parties, and they could say, here's the token, you have it too. See, our families are friends. And so that would be okay, come on in. And it would be one of those ways that they would keep ties, and they would form alliances, kind of a foreign policy way of doing. I mean, it's kind of a neat thing, actually, to think about how seriously hospitality was taken. But it's basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? We're gonna form this bond between our families, and we're gonna be tied as friends. Okay. So this was, again, very, very common. And you can see these kinds of things a lot in the biblical story. Hospitality is something you can see all over the place. And we're going to look at a few examples of that in a second. But if you were to go back, for instance, and look at the Greek literature of Homer, the famous philosopher poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, he has a lot to say about this topic. And of course, Homer is a huge influence on the ancient Greek world and into the Roman world. His writings are still, very classic, and so there's all these things about hospitality in his writings. One of the things that's kind of a central idea in those writings is that as you invited a person in, a stranger, into your home, and you shared with them your hospitable plate, your home, you give them a meal. But one of the regular practices is that a guest who is invited into a home does not reveal their identity until after they've shared a meal. So you come into the home, they welcome you, they give you a meal, and then it's during the meal or after the meal that then questions are beginning to be asked about who are you, who are your descendants, where have you come from, what sorts of things are you doing, what's your mission, what are you traveling for? And the guest was not expected to reveal any of this until they had been taken care of. So Different world, right? Different than what we live in. Sometimes, if this ended up being, in some of the myths and fables that we're told, if this was a theogonic encounter where the guest was a divine being of some sort or a god, then they understood that to be a test of the character of the person giving the hospitality. Are you going to invite me in or not? Are you going to treat me well as a stranger? Do you have the moral virtue of hospitality? And so if they did that, then that was sometimes rewarded by the god. They would give, some sort of special reward to the person after they have treated the person well. So all that to say, very, very big deal. Very important in the ancient world. And we can see this in the scriptures. Even in the early Genesis stories, you have Abraham. If you think of chapter 18, where Abraham is visited by the three men, right? It's right before Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. There's this excellent display of hospitality by Abraham. Right? You read the text, he runs back and forth to get the fattened calf and and he tells his wife Sarah to run and there's just this, so they're just watching, just observing this thing. And it ends up being a theogonic display of hospitality where suddenly there's a revelation, oh, this is a divine being. And so it's a one example of that. Lot in chapter 19, even though this might give a little bit of clarity around Lot in chapter 19 when he is visited by these men, and then the town comes, and they are not so hospitable. But Lot is even recognized as a person who shows great hospitality by offering his daughters instead of the guests, right, to the angry townsmen. And so we just look at that and we're like, what is going on? Well, this is a hospitality thing. This is Lot's insane hospitality code that he is sticking to. And what we think about that now is obviously probably different. But in that culture, that was a revered thing. So Lot does this. Rebecca in Genesis chapter 24 is another one who shows an amazing hospitality as the servant of Abraham, Eliezer, has gone to get Isaac a wife, and he approaches the town. And one of the things that they would do, if you came into a town, if you're a visitor, you would wait at the city gate, or you would go to a public place like a well. And you would wait there, and if the town had hospitality within it, somebody would come and invite you to stay with them. So Eliezer comes, he stays at the well, and he encounters Rebecca. Rebecca shows amazing hospitality, and Eliezer is so ecstatic about the whole thing and so glad for God answering his prayer that he actually, when he sits down to eat, he's not expected to reveal his identity or his mission, but he just says, I'm not even going to eat until I tell you everything. That's really backwards. That's unexpected. It's a shocking thing for the ancients, but they say, okay. So he does it. Anyway, big deal. Hospitality, major thing. It's interesting. There's some other examples. I'm not going to go into the details of some of these, but Melchizedek is another one in Genesis 14. Rahab shows amazing hospitality to the people in Joshua. Manoah in Judges 13, Boaz, to Ruth and her family, the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings chapter 4. And then you have the prophets regularly chastising Israel for their lack of hospitality to the stranger and the poor and the needy. This is one of the reasons this is so emphasized over and over again, is because to not do that it's a bigger deal than we often think of it in that culture. So the great sin of Sodom, interestingly, in Ezekiel 16, is not merely the sexual immorality, which is usually what we talk about, but it's the lack of hospitality. That's what it says in Ezekiel 16. The sin of Sodom is this: they did not care for the needy. So it's so different emphases in different cultures. And And of course, in the New Testament, we see this emphasis continued. Even King Herod. Remember when we talked about King Herod, how evil he was, and how just the kind of man that he was? Even King Herod didn't break the hospitality code. He had in his palace a chamber that had support for 100 guests. So even he stuck to this thing, as much as he was godless in so many other ways. So, big deal. In light of Jesus' message and ministry, we obviously see Jesus himself was somebody who needed hospitality regularly. He was invited to stay at people's houses. Mary and Martha and Lazarus, he was supported by people who believed in what he was doing. But he said himself, I have no place to lay my head. So, with all that as kind of hopefully a big picture sense of hospitality is like, if you could think of our moral virtues today, the things that we would put above everything else, in the ancient world, hospitality is up at the top. It is just up there. Now, it is after urging Jesus to stay with us in this passage, in Luke 24, back to Luke 24. It's after they urge Jesus to stay with us. They haven't yet recognized him, but they have a meal, and then his identity is revealed, right? And this is right in line with ancient understandings of how this works. But he's revealed after they have the meal, and Jesus' identity suddenly is given to them after he breaks the bread, and then he disappears. And I was asking the question, what if they had not practiced hospitality? What if these guys who were walking with Jesus on the road had refused to do that? Because not everybody did it. And we have all kinds of reasons why we could think, well, maybe they don't want to invite this guy in. But they urged him to stay. What if they had not? Would they have missed Jesus being revealed to them? Would they have missed his revelation of who he is? I was wondering about that. Would he have passed by them unrecognized? And is it possible that when we practice a certain kind of hospitality, particularly to marginalized people, that we will see Jesus? This is kind of my big question. He was recognized after he was embraced. But they didn't know who he was when they embraced him. So in Matthew 25, we have this famous passage, whatever you do for the least of these, you have done for me. And whatever you did not do for the least of these, you have not done for me. And in that parable, it's just so clear. When did we invite you in as a stranger? When did we care for you? When did we visit the sick? Or when did we, see you and care for you? And he's just very clear. Well, whatever you did to these folks, this is what you did for me. Whenever you visited those in prison, whenever you cared for the needy, whenever you invited in the stranger, you did it for me. And it's such this just direct correlation to the way that we treat people. The way that we treat especially strangers, foreigners, marginalized people you would not maybe normally want to treat with hospitality. That's taken very personally by Jesus. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, we have this very well-known verse as well. It says, "Behold, I stand at the door and I knock. And if you invite me in, I'll come in and I'll eat with you." And that's kind of been reduced to, if you pray the sinner's prayer, Jesus will come into your life. And I think that's true. But I think that's really, there's some hospitality stuff going on in that passage. In Hebrews 13, it tells us that some people have entertained angels without knowing it. They've entertained people, and it says theoxany, right? Is that strange thing. I think some of you have stories about that, actually. I've heard a couple of them. Interesting stuff. Now, real easy to talk about how this was important in the ancient world. And it might be tempting to just make a direct correlation to, well, now we need to just invite every stranger that we see to come stay in our house. And that would be a bold thing to say. However, I want to acknowledge some things. In the ancient world, this was understood as a moral virtue in a way that our culture does not understand. In other words, it was widely accepted that this was something that you do. In our world, it's not so much the case. Very, very different. We typically kind of do the opposite, actually. It's considered taboo not to make great efforts at hospitality to strangers in the ancient world, especially if it's evening and they have nowhere to stay. This is just something you do. But in our world, we're just like, well, if you're traveling, you got to have a plan for where you're traveling, and there's lots of hotels, and if you have the money to travel, you probably have the money to stay at, we just have all these other different conventions going on. So it's not an easy application. We also do not have the number of the traveling modes are different. A lot of times people travel by car or by bus or by plane. They're not usually walking out on foot with a camel in a backpack or something like that. So it's not easy to think about how we do this. And I don't know that I'm going to have a direct application exactly, but to rather give you something to chew on, because we know Jesus tells us we need to care for the least of these. We need to care for the needy. We need to show hospitality. This is told again in the New Testament over and over. Practice hospitality. And this is the context for which that was said. If you look at the scriptures in Luke 10, we have Jesus sending the disciples on a mission, and they go out to proclaim the gospel, right? Luke 10. And he says to them, when you enter a house, look for the person of peace. And if you find a person of peace, then stay there. Let them give you their hospitality. But if they reject you, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that town. And it's a hospitality thing. If they refuse to be hospitable to you, shake the dust off your feet. So are we really expected to do this today? That's a hard question. We don't have the hospitality code. We don't have the thing that kind of protects both strangers and hosts, right? It's a different world. Generally, when a stranger comes to my door, I have all kinds of suspicions, right? I'm like, what do you want? What are you selling? I'm certainly not inviting you in for dinner. Just go find a hotel, I am very suspicious. I'll just admit it. When a stranger comes to my door, I'm like, what are you doing here? There's this immediate thing. This is not normal, right? In the ancient world, it's very normal to have strangers coming to your door. So can't they just, stay in hotels? Can't they just find their own way? Strangers don't typically stop at random houses, though that does happen occasionally in today's world. But the modern city gate, where travelers, strangers tend to go, are churches or social services, right? Centers in the community. That's typically where people go who need assistance if they're traveling. And it's interesting because pastors actually are tested in this very thing all the time. When I was a pastor in Kansas, I could not believe how many people stopped by during a week who needed some sort of assistance, who was traveling somewhere, who happened to lose their wallet, or I had all kinds of great stories I could tell you about the stories that were told about, how I was out on this. I remember one guy, he was out on a job. He was a logger from the East Coast, and he was making his way back to Colorado, and he ran out of money. And so you hear these stories, and you're just like, really? And so we have these things in place to try to kind of help us discern these things. In Kansas, we had this alliance, ministerial alliance, and we have that here too with the pastors in the area. And we do our very best to communicate with each other whenever somebody shows up like this. Because a lot of times what does happen is they go from place to place to place and tell the same story until they get a lot of money, and then they go. And then sadly, there's a lot of fraud and a lot of scamming that happens. And so I always have this tension whenever somebody comes by. It's like, are you pulling my leg? I hate getting fooled. One time when I was in Chicago as a college student, this guy came up to me on the street, and he gave me this big sad sob story about whatever, his life. And I believed him. I was young. I was in my 20s, and felt compassion for this guy. He seemed very genuine. I gave him some money, and I watched him go down the street and go into the liquor store. And I just remember feeling so taken advantage of. And it's like one of those things where it's like, I just took advantage of me. I was being kind, and you took advantage of my kindness. How dare you? And it just irks me. I mean, I don't like that. I feel, it's a despicable thing to do. How dare you? Lost $20 that day. Never getting it back. So we have these guards up. At least I do. And when you've heard enough stories of people who have come through and share with you how, their car broke down, or their relative is being rushed to the hospital, and I've got to get there quick, and I need money, and are you going to help me, or are you going to be a total mean person that won't help me out, and they put this thing on you. And you want to be wise. You don't want to be a fool. So, if anybody wants to volunteer to deal with those cases whenever they come here, just let me know, and I'll give you a call. Happens a lot. But does this excuse us from helping strangers? Does this excuse us from doing what we can? That's a hard question. Sometimes we just don't know if a person legitimately needs help, or if they're just being lazy, or if they're just being a crook, or if they're just taking advantage of you. And I was thinking about how there's this impulse within the American psyche that we should only feel obligated to help or bless somebody if they truly need it. Otherwise, they should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be a good, independent, self-sufficient individual. And we're just so terrified of being taken advantage of. And it's very, very easy to just kind of blow it off and say they're all the same, and they're all crooks, and, who are we to if they really wanted to, they could support themselves. That's kind of the mindset. And I think a lot of times that's true. There are people who live off the system. There are people who take advantage. It happens. But as Christians, what do we do with this very strong emphasis in the New Testament? These words of Jesus from Matthew 25. What do we do with these? So, I want to return to our passage. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it's when they urged the unrecognized Jesus, "Stay with us," that they are given the gift of recognizing him as he broke the bread. The early church practiced meal sharing, hospitality. The Lord's Supper as a ritual was born out of this practice. They regularly invited in the newcomers and the strangers and the marginalized and those who were needing help. So, as a very introductory thought into this, perhaps we need to think about this as a general posture toward other people. Stay with us. Let us break bread together. To have the posture of somebody who is open to that, who genuinely seeks to care for those who might need help, even when we're suspicious that they don't. We have to deal with our inner stuff when that comes up. Because when it really comes down to it, my big hesitation is I don't want to be taken advantage of. But I could help them. But I don't want to be taken advantage of. I want there to be a genuine need there. It better be right. I only want to bless people who really need to be blessed. What do we do with that? But if we practice as a general posture, stay with us, let us break bread together, perhaps we will see Jesus among those we least expect him to be among. Perhaps we will recognize him among people that we did not think we would see him. We're given the bread and the wine, the sacred meal in which we partake to recognize Jesus, to commune with Jesus. And in doing so, we proclaim his death for us, his hospitality toward us, even though we rejected him, even though we took advantage of him. He came into this world as one of us, but the world did not receive him because we preferred the darkness to the light. And yet, he gave himself for us, and he has opened up a new way through his death and resurrection. And together, the Father and the Son and the Spirit say, stay with us. So our challenge as we wrestle through this is to find our heart posture, first of all. How do we think about this? Because it is so easy to make blanket statements around this and to just lump people in to a certain kind of people. And I don't think that's wise. The hard work of discerning how to practice hospitality, particularly to strangers. You know, it's easy to do it with people you know. In fact, if you want some good hospitality, I recommend a few particular people in this church. You might want to go over to Levon and Bev's house and, let them treat you to some great hospitality. When we first came up here, that was amazing. I don't see Levon and Bev. Are they here today? Well, you can tell them I said this. When we came up, on our first visit, we were invited into Levon and Bev's house, and just amazing hospitality. I mean, we were strangers. We were treated like the best of friends you could imagine. Great food, great everything. Loved our kids, gave them presents. I mean, just crazy. That's crazy hospitality. And many of you, we've shared times and meals with some of you, and it's just the church. I mean, that's just normal. That just should be normal church stuff right there. But it's still great. It's just don't ever get tired of that. Don't ever take that for granted, because that's a gift within the body of Christ that we can give each other. Be hospitable, love each other, bless each other. But we want to make sure that this doesn't stick within the church walls either. We want to look beyond ourselves and ask the question: how do we do this to the strangers? How do we bless people outside of those that we're super comfortable with? What do we do with that? So as we come to the table this morning, I want to just invite us to reflect on this idea of hospitality as a very emphasized, very strongly practiced New Testament idea that doesn't easily translate into today's culture because there's so many different things. But I think we start with a posture. What is my posture towards outsiders, towards the others, towards the strangers, towards people I don't know, and I'm not necessarily sure if I trust them? What is my posture? Are we ready to perhaps encounter Jesus in a theophany? I think the invitation is, stay with us. Here's where you'll find us. Stay with me. So let's keep our eyes open. As we share the table this morning, Steve, if you'd come on up.